And now, welcome back to the KATR Classics loving retelling of the childhood classic Lucy Maud well, not so much Lucy Maud Montgomery, it's more Kappo and the Revs, Anne of Green Gables.
Well, Lucy Maud Montgomery, how dare you let these men, Kappo and the Rev, bust in here and do Chapter 4, Morning at Green Gables.
As Anne tossed and turned in the sun-drenched East Gable room, she could not remember where she was for a moment, and wondered sadly to herself if she had died in that drafty, dirty, old asylum room, and awoke in one of the rooms Jesus Christ had described in the book of John.
In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? John chapter 14, verse 2.
Anne's eyes awakened in what seemed like a blissful dream world, provided by her Lord and Savior. She raced to throw away the gray sash that the sun was beckoning her through. She tossed the pretty dressings aside, and her eyes feasted upon 80 sprawling acres of cucumber patches, and thought to herself,
No wonder they call it Green Gables.
Anne stopped herself and sighed.
And I cannot stay at Green Gables.
The trees began to taunt her as if to say,
Sorry to see you go so soon.
And the brook babbled back at her.
Don't let the door hit ya.
Anne wondered to herself what would happen if she simply barricaded herself in the East Gable and refused to leave. Eventually, a bold-hearted young beau would call to her from the windowside and beckon her to let down her beautiful alabaster brow.
Anne peered out the window to see Angus Iverson helping himself to an armsful of cucumbers.
Good morning, Mr. Iverson,
she called. Good morning, my girl,
Angus replied with a wide and inviting smile. How are you?
Anne asked with a coy wonder in her eye. Oh, I can see that look in your eye, girl. They'll never let you barricade yourself in there. I've tried. You have the look of a body about to barricade themselves into a sweet situation. But let me tell you, Isaiah Pringle once tried...
A harsh knock could be heard upon the East Gable door.
Come on down for breakfast, Miss Shirley. I need to talk to you,
Marilla commanded.
Anne swept down the staircase, but by the time she reached the parlor, it became a slow trudge, each step taking her further away from that promised dream world estate. She, unlike the ancient Israelites, wouldn't mind wandering the parlor for 40 years before confronting Marilla Cuthbert in the kitchen. It wouldn't take quite so long.
As Anne entered the kitchen, her starving senses feasted on the sights and smells of the most delicious breakfast she had ever seen. It was simple, but it was absolutely perfect, and Anne sat quickly and expectantly at the table. Rather than having a heaping helping of eggs and sausage, Marilla placed a prayer card on the other end of the table and beckoned her to sit.
Come sit here and learn this lesson,
Marilla said plainly.
Anne looked at the prayer card and smiled to herself. It was the exact same verse she had woken pondering about when she was sure she was dead and spending her first moments in God's great mansion. She takes a fleeting look at the card and recites it.
John chapter 14, verse 2. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you?
Anne knew scripture better than most of the church-going sect of Avonlea. She was first and foremost an admirer of pretty words, and the Bible, which had been preached to her many times, was full of frighteningly beautiful language. Anne had a memory for that sort of thing and found that she had most of these verses loaded in her mind, ready to be delivered by her very active and deft tongue.
Marilla is taken aback and a little frightened by Anne's instantaneous ability to read and recite her prayer card, and a shiver goes up her spine as Anne finishes the verse, and Marilla mutters to herself,
My stars, that sounds just like the Reverend Allen, and the man is 52 years old and the product of the largest seminary in Canada.
Marilla turns to Anne with a look of both amazement and fear.
What sort of religious studies have you?
She wasn't sure how to finish the question. Oh, none, really.
Anne smiled back at Marilla, looking again like the perfect heathen as her eyes darted about, devilishly devouring all there was to see and eat. Have you ever been to church?
Marilla asked, assuming the answer. Oh yes, many times. Mrs. Hammond used to let me enter to use the washroom on Sundays after I watched the children, and I would imagine myself a great Christian martyr ready to face the fiery furnace and a den of lions. The parishioners wouldn't allow me to attend regular service on account of me being an orphan and looking as frightful as I do. That, and on the first day with the Hammonds, I accidentally spilled the cistern of holy water and warped the floorboards of the entire sanctuary. They seemed awfully upset about it, but I would think if I were to pray for my knees every day, I would rather kneel on bumpy, curvy boards rather than straight ones. There's so much more inspiration in it, don't you agree?
Of all things, child,
Marilla interjected.
prayers are not affected by floorboard. Marilla's eyes darted to the switch that she had gone out and cut early that morning in preparations for negotiations with this unwanted orphan. Anne also looked and saw the very familiar implement.
If I were to really pray, I would go out into the forest and find the place that gives way to a great misty cucumber patch and look upon the brilliant night sky and a full moon and just feel a prayer, Anne said as she clutched her hands to her chest and nearly appeared to levitate.
It does not matter what a person feels about God. It is what God feels about the person,
said Marilla, wondering if she was helping or hurting her standing with the Lord at this very second. Well, the vicar at the asylum once told me that God made my hair red on purpose, and after that I never cared for him,
Anne said with an assuredness that worried Marilla greatly. But as Marilla would come to learn, it was wise to wait until Anne had fully unloaded her thought before snapping to respond.
But I am glad you had me learn this, Ms. Cuthbert.
Hold your tongue and learn it then,
Marilla commanded as she grabbed a fly swatter and slapped the large June fly that had come through the window at night. Yes, Ms. Cuthbert,
Anne replied smartly, a phrase she would refrain for many years to come, but Anne didn't know that yet.
Outside, Angus Iverson had been piling brush in the back lot and had been coming back and forth each time he brought another pile, craning his neck to see through the window. He lit the large pile of brush and tinder, and it looked to be a great pyre.
What say, Marilla? We gonna do this?
Angus shouted.
Marilla shook her head and, without a word, closed the door and shuttered the window.
Are we waiting for Matthew?
Anne asked, wondering why she had not been offered the pile of glistening breakfast foods. Matthew has been to work in the fields hours ago,
Marilla responded as if it was an accusation and perhaps a reservation for future breakfasts. Oh, well, I see that I will have to get up pretty early in the morning if I'm ever to have breakfast with Matthew,
Anne said hopefully.
He seems like such a kindred spirit.
You're both queer enough, if that's what you mean by kindred spirits,
Marilla states with a grim smile.
Marilla banged on a bowl of warm green pudding before Anne, and the young girl turned a shade shy of the green, staring back at her from the bowl.
What is this?
Anne asked, staring at the large pile of peppered eggs heaped on the skillet. This is what we feed the men who work at this farm. It's my world-famous cucumber porridge, and I've never once heard any complaint,
Marilla said, having never once spoken to any of the French-speaking farmhands who had eaten the mash. Oh, I don't mind the work, Ms. Cuthbert, and I'm well known for outworking the boys and many times the men,
Anne said proudly. Stuffin' nonsense,
Marilla barked and then gave way to a giggle.
Proverbs 16:18, child. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before the fall. Here, put these boots on.
Marilla looked out the corner window to see Angus Iverson attempting to put out the witch's pyre with a bucket of sand and water he had drudged up from the brook. The smoke curled beautifully down the pastures and into the woods, creating a haunting ambiance for Anne's day of hard labor in the Cuthbert's cucumber fields.
Anne was glad to have good, honest, hard work to do as she traipsed the grounds of Green Gables. Like a cartographer on the shores of a distant land, her mind was flooded with new imagination as the day unfolded. Marilla had given her 7 tasks and promised a fine dinner upon their completion.
Anne had been set to 7 Herculean tasks. Move the sorrel mare to the east field, take a bushel of cucumbers to the Avonlea crossroads, restuff the scarecrow in the east field, since the last one seemed to have been burned, spread the rat traps in the chicken coop, shoo the inbred cats from the hayloft, run a bucket of water from the creek to the cistern, and finally, weed the entire 80 acres of cucumber patches.
It seemed like a lot, but Anne took it with a childish virtue that stymied Marilla's plan of overwhelming the child.
Anne set out early, and after playing in the waters of the brook for a while, she ran the bucket to the cistern. From there, she took a glance at the 80 acres and noticed not a single weed. So she rode the sorrel mare bareback around Barry's pond and into the east field as requested. And it was hardly noon.
Anne and Matthew shared a sandwich under the old apple tree, and then they talked Angus Iverson into walking the bushel of cucumbers up to the crossroads. They traded him an apple, and Matthew didn't punch him when Angus hinted at an alternative form of payment.
Anne moved one odd-looking kitten from the hayloft to the chicken coop, and it made quick work of the rats and 2 tasks at once. From there, she stuffed the scarecrow into a frightening pose inspired by the vicar from the asylum, giving a particularly fiery sermon to these unwanted crows. Anne wondered to herself who was more unwanted, her or these cackling crows.
Throughout the day, Marilla had been keeping a strict eye on Anne with an E as she set about her daily tasks. While the work had been done, it had been done with far too much childish ease and with cunning that bordered on witchcraft.
The Cuthberts convened that evening, each one with a sure and hopeful heart. Marilla was sure that Matthew knew this orphan child was of little use to him on the farm and had to go back to the asylum first thing in the morning. Anne was sure that upon having completed her 7 Herculean tasks, her future at Green Gables had been secured. Matthew was sure he didn't want Angus Iverson near the chicken coop ever again.
Anne retired with a belly full of Canada's finest home cooking, and she instantly fell asleep on her pillow, content in the knowledge that she had found home.
The next morning, Anne awoke and gave in to temptation. She named every tree and flower she could see outside her window. She gazed at the sunrise when she heard Matthew release the Jersey cows into the west fields at dawn. She sat there enraptured and fell in love with Green Gables.
Then, to Anne's horror, she saw Marilla donning her finest Sunday dress as she led the sorrel mare in front of the buggy. Anne watched Marilla apply the tack so quickly and furiously that it spooked the mare with every snap and cinch. Anne thought to herself,
Well, maybe she's going to town for some brown sugar.
Marilla's eyes then darted up to the east gable window and apprehended this orphan. Anne froze as their eyes met, and Marilla tightened her focus into what seemed like a cruel glare, yet she was merely struggling to see if it was Anne that was visible, or was it those old ghosts again?
Anne came out the front door and was instantly ushered into the buggy.
Matthew opened the yard gate for them as they drove slowly through. He said to nobody in particular, as it seemed,
Little Jerry Boot from the creek was here this morning, and I told him I guessed I'd hired him for the summer.
Marilla made no reply, but she hit the unlucky sorrel mare with such a vicious clip with the whip that the fat mare, unused to such treatment, whizzed indignantly down the lane at an alarming pace. As they passed the Lynns, the mare defecated as Marilla nodded, as was customary. Matthew, leaning over the gate, looking wistfully after them.
Well, I guess that's the end of chapter 4.
And there you have it, folks. It's Kappo in the Revs, KATR Classics presentation of Anne of Green Gables. This has been chapter 4, Morning at Green Gables.